Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm John Coleman. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and on behalf of the College and the Department of Economics and the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute, I am very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event, a lecture and event. We are enjoying a beautiful and stimulating spring day, and we will enjoy a beautiful, if I might say, and stimulating lecture and discussion tonight as well. Today's conversation will be focused on the latest research on government debt and how sovereign debt models can inform local and state finance. This is precisely the kind of rich, research-based conversations that we are proud to host at CLA and that the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute has become known for. The Institute was founded in 2010 with the mission of informing public policy and supporting leading-edge economic research. Heller-Hurwicz has quickly established itself as a force. It has also strengthened the already stellar reputation of our Department of Economics, which has historically ranked among the very best in the country and in the world, and is known for developing field-shaping research. Heller-Hurwicz itself is a great example of some of what we try to do in CLA, particularly the way that we try to fuse together our research with public engagement. We are a liberal arts college at a land-grant research institution, and that means we have to be rooted in a community of world-class scholars who then are in exchange and in discussion with the communities around them. This research excellence infuses their teaching, their service, and the outreach that they do beyond the campus walls, beyond the campus boundaries. So it is fitting that Heller-Hurwicz thinks of itself as a bridge to the multiple communities in the Twin Cities, but really to the nation as well. Events like tonight's lecture are one part of that mission. With that as our background and introduction to Heller-Hurwicz, I would like to introduce Professor V.V. Chari, who will be moderating this evening's conversation. Professor Chari is the Paul Frenzel Land-Grant Professor of Liberal Arts in our Department of Economics and an advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He also served as the founding director of the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute from 2010 to 2016. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. I do want to just give you one heads up about some future activity. CLA just celebrated or reached its 150th anniversary back in February. In the 2018-2019 academic year, we will have a whole series of events, panels, lectures, exhibits, archival displays, and so on. You'll be hearing about those, so I encourage you very much to have your eye tuned for those and to come back to campus, those of you who are visiting us, and to see some of the depth of the research happening across the college now. We intend our celebration to be very much a forward-looking event, not so much what did CLA do over the last 150 years, but where are we now, where is our research and engagement and our teaching taking us. So please have an eye open for that. With that, I welcome Professor Chari to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Let me add my welcome to all of you to join us on this event. The mission of the Heller-Hurwicz Institute can be summarized by saying that we're trying to combine the best of Walter Heller with the best of Leo Hurwicz. Walter Heller was always focused on centrally important policy questions. And Leo Hurwicz was always interested in developing the frontiers of economic theory in order to address those kinds of questions. When we were kicking around the ideas about what we should do for this particular event, we started from the premise that one of the important policy questions that confronts us as a nation, and confronts governments for that matter all across the developed world, is that state and local financing, especially with respect to the kinds of pension and healthcare obligations that state and local governments confront and are likely to confront, are a serious challenge. They're a challenge partly for demographic reasons, for good social reasons. We've all decided to live a lot longer, and we've decided to have a lot fewer children. Combine all of that, that means that in about 20 or 30 years, there's going to be roughly 1.5 of you supporting 1 of me. And so work very hard. So confronting those kinds of challenges, how do we provide health care for and retirement financing, is a problem that the governments of, among other states, Illinois, Puerto Rico, Connecticut, New Jersey, have all been struggling with mixed results. And the obvious question that comes from all that is whether we will eventually follow a time-honored American tradition, which is to default on debt. At the state and local government level, we did that frequently and with great joy all through the 19th century, and we've done it in implicit ways at the federal government level as well. And so there has to be something that we can learn from the Argentinas, the Ecuadors, the Spains, the Italys, and the Greeces of this world about how exactly one handles the challenges of extravagant promises to large portions of the population. I can't think of 2 better people to address this kind of question. What can we learn from the work that we've done on sovereign default to inform our thinking on the threats and challenges that confront state and local governments than these 2 gentlemen. Manuel Amador graduated from MIT and was at Stanford for a number of years. We were very fortunate to be able to steal him from there. Manuel is one of the leading theorists in the theory of sovereign default. It's hard to find somebody who has thought more deeply and constructively about the theoretical aspects of this. Mark Wright received his PhD from the University of Chicago, was at UCLA, and then at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And he now serves in a distinguished position. He is Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Mark has thought equally hard about both the theoretical aspects and also about the empirical aspects of the literature on sovereign default and about the setting and why do governments default? For that matter, why do people lend them money in the first place? And so on. So I think we're in for an extraordinarily stimulating discussion. We'll start with Manuel and then move on to Mark. So Manuel, you're on.
Can you hear me? Not really. Can you hear me now? Yes. Yeah? All right. So thank you for the Institute for inviting me to talk here today, and thanks, Shari, for that completely undeserved introduction, at least from my part. So today I'm going to be talking about sovereign debt from the perspectives of emerging markets and less developed countries. That's actually my area of work, and that's going to be mostly the focus of the talk. So just a disclaimer, the views I'm going to be presenting today do not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, nor the views of the Federal Reserve System. So the question is sovereign debt. And usually the focus in the literature has been on less developed countries. And the reason for that is because they borrow a lot and they default a lot. In particular, what they borrow, usually they do it from foreigners, and historically took the shape of debt contracts that were indexed in a foreign currency. So they could not control the currency in which their debt was denominated. And there are two key things that drive most of the questions in this literature, which is which is the fact that these are sovereign nations, and just as US states, there are limited ability to take them to court. There's no clearly bankruptcy procedures. There's really no collateral of significant magnitude that can be posted for these loans. So just before I show you a few things, let me first kind of give you a few facts so that we all know what we're talking about. So these are less developed countries, so these are poor nations. They borrow a lot externally. So they can go all the way from 25 to 60% of their GDP, annual GDP in debts. They usually repay. So defaults are rare, but they do happen. And when they happen, the losses can be massive. It could go all the way from very lenient treatment to creditors to really, really like complete repudiation. Complete repudiation is rare. I think only Cuba, my home country, China, and Russia did it. I think those are the big, Russia in the Soviet Union Revolution, Cuba in the Cuban Revolution, and China obviously with Mao. So they are rare, but they are haircuts, and they lose. Foreign creditors lose a lot. There is a lot of heterogeneity, so one thing I want to provide you today, I'm going to show you a few facts, kind of average, but there is a lot of variation underlying these facts. All these countries, they look similar, but some of them are quite different in many of the things. We know a couple of other things, that defaults are more likely for countries that have defaulted in the past, something that we call the serial defaulter issue. And they tend to happen for some reason kind of simultaneously. So countries tend to go into default more kind of at the same time. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to divide the rest of this presentation in these questions. I want to kind of talk through why countries borrow. Why is that? Why do they repay? I think actually, by the way, I think that's the fundamental question in this literature. Why do the lenders lend? In some sense, that's easier to understand. I mean, they buy junk bonds, so they can lend to these countries. But there are problems there, and I would like to emphasize to you that lenders, the lender side in this equation can go wrong. And then, what can go wrong? And then some discussion of policies from the perspective of the LDCs, less developed countries, and what have they learned after all these years of default, and do we see any learning from these governments? I would like to convince you at the end that they are learning and they are changing their behavior. So let me start by why do countries borrow? Right? That's kind of it's a question. They have high interest rates when they borrow, and still they do it. So I'm going to try to go through economic arguments for why they borrow, and then kind of convince you that some of them don't make sense. So the first one that you may think, okay, why would you borrow? Well, you have a project. It's going to be very productive in a few years. You don't have the resources today to finance it. So you just get a loan from these foreigners who are out there, waiting to finance these things. And you create the project, invest, and you grow. And then once you grew and you are rich and more productive in the future, you pay it back. That's economic theory tells you that could be a good thing, and maybe countries should do this stuff. I will try to argue that that's not what we see. So what I'm going to show you here is a plot of the two axes. In the horizontal axis is the change in the public external debt over GDP. That's annualized, so that's telling you how fast their public debt externally is it growing. And what I have in the vertical axis is the growth rate relative to GDP, how fast these countries are growing. I don't know, I see a negative line there quite strongly telling you, well, the countries that grew the fastest were not the ones that actually accumulated most debt. It's actually the opposite. Countries that accumulated debt ended up growing very slowly. So we can cross that out as a possible interpretation of why they're borrowing. I'm going to have a Marco Rubio moment. I'm going to keep going. All right, so why do LDCs borrow? Second thing, maybe they're borrowing because they want to alleviate the effects of temporary shocks. Economic theory tells you that's something you should do. When things are bad, you go out there and borrow financial expenditures. When things are good, you pay it back. Okay, so that seems completely in accordance to what we would think they should do, but they don't. They spend more when things are good. Their revenue is less volatile than their spending. That's already telling you there's something wrong. They borrow more in good times. That's exactly the opposite of what they should be doing. And if they are really worried about protecting themselves against shocks, we don't see, until recently, large accumulation of assets, things that will protect them from these things. So that kind of tells me, okay, it cannot be this ability, this desire to smooth their expenditures over time because of shocks. So what's left? And I think what left is impatience, okay? And impatience, by this I mean, when we think about the economic agent who is making the decision in these places to borrow and tax and spend, that agent, we think that agent is impatient. And how do we do that? Well, we take economic models of sovereign debt, and we try to fit them to the data that we see, and we try to figure out, what does that data tells me? What is the impatience that agent needs to have to justify the amount of debt they take and the risk they put their countries? Because I'm going to show you in a second, default is a risky thing. So, all right, so how? And it has to be big, okay? It has to be too big to be reasonable, all right? So he's a particular trade that actually what I did, just let me tell you, there's a lot of variation, again, in everything I show you here. There's variation across all these parameters, across different countries. But I went to the literature and I just picked a bunch of papers, figure out that parameter, the discount factor of the agent making the decision, and I just took an average, okay? And I did this calculation. Okay, so this is the trade that these governments are taking. They're saying, do you prefer $1 next year for sure, or do you prefer $0.65 today for sure? No risk, no uncertainty, same level of consumption across periods. And the answer is, yeah, they will take the 65 cents. So it's a level of impatience that cannot be justified by the preferences of the population. We don't think people are that impatient. How do we know that? Because interest rates are not that high. All right. Now, when I say impatience, you think, what do you mean, Manuel, by impatience? That seems like a weird concept. What is the impatience of a government? Well, it's an amalgam. It's a combination of a bunch of stuff, including what we think is the political economy underlying these decisions, the desire to spend to their end and to save, have different names in the literature. The government myopia is reflected in this parameter. But these countries, it seems that to be able for us to justify the decisions, they have to be very impatient. Here's another question I want to talk about, which is why do they repay? And that one I think is the key question, because this is where the costs are really hidden. How much do they lose when they default? And there are a couple of arguments out there. I'm going to show you two. One is some notion of a reputation. You have a reputation for being a country that repays, and if you don't, then you're perceived to be a country that defaults. And that maybe is not a good thing, because the next time you re-enter the market, you're going to face high interest rates. And we see that, actually. We see that countries that default, once they come back in, they face high interest rates. So meaning like the market is convinced that these guys have lost some of their reputation by defaulting. There is another one that we also know. Stuff goes wrong. Defaults are associated with a bunch of stuff going wrong. It's not causal. We cannot really say default caused this, but we see that the output falls, investment tanks, bank crises happen, high unemployment results. There's a lot of bad economic outcomes associated with a default. So let me show you a plot. And this plot also tells you the magnitude of what we're talking about. These are huge things. So every dot here is a country. It's an average of years before and after a default event. A default event is written down as year 0 in the axis. That's the year that the default happened. And we can look back 3 years before and a few years after and see the behavior of the measure that we care the most about, GDP per capita. Okay? We want to look at how that behaves. So we look at it before, and you see in year 0, GDP per capita falls. The year of the default is associated with a massive recession. Here is around 7% of GDP. That's massive. Okay? We look over time how this output GDP measure changes, and it remains low for a long time. So it reaches 10% and keep going. Never goes back even after 5 years. This is an average. This is done for countries that treated their creditors badly. That's what I mean by a hard default. It's countries that really didn't negotiate, they really were tough on creditors. They had a massive economic problem in their hands. Now, it's hard for us to infer from this that default caused this fall in output, but it's clearly part of the ingredients in the picture. And just to give you a sense of the magnitudes, I plotted here the same plot done for the US Great Recession. Okay? So it's massive recession in the US, one of the biggest ones since the Great Depression. There is really no comparison in terms of magnitudes in what we see. These are big shocks, and they lose a lot. How much time do I have left? I don't know. 7 minutes, all right. So let me now briefly discuss, this is like the supply of the bonds, if you wish, the governments that are selling these bonds. And there is another side of this equation. It always takes two to tango, which is the guy who is buying, the persons who are buying the bonds, the lenders. And what do we know about them? Buying sovereign bonds is risky. I already told you the losses are high and the probability of default is small but non-trivial. But the prices are low, so the yield is high. So the basic justification for what we see is that these investors are just taking bets on these countries, and they are being compensated extra, actually. We see excess returns in these holdings. So they pay the premium of default. They also get the risk premium associated with this. Just like John bonds, but I would like to argue, though, that for sovereign debt, this side of the market is also important because it leads to fragility. And let me just briefly tell you what can go wrong when you put these things together. The main idea is, I kind of put it in this diagram. And actually, maybe during the discussion, if we go back to Europe, I think this probably have a lot to do with what happened there. Is this relationship between the high interest rates and the default likelihood of a country. So you could have a country that is in sound fundamentals, it's shaky, but it's not so bad. It's trying to do something to get better, and suddenly interest rates spike. Okay, so the interest rate goes up. The increase in interest rates now means this country has to do a bigger job at reducing its debt, at controlling its expenditures. And because those actions are all more costly, the likelihood of default goes up. It's just related. It's just like one comes to the next. But then if the likelihood of default is more likely, then that justifies the increase in these rates. And this feedback loop, this idea that things are fragile here. If I think you're not going to pay me, I'm going to charge you high interest rates. And as a result, you don't pay me because the interest rate is too high. Might be driving some of the dynamics, some of the coordinations and the similarities that we see in the movement in these spreads across countries over time. So it could lead to confidence crisis. It could also lead to amplification of shocks that in principle were tiny, but because they trigger expectations of lenders in adverse ways, they become much bigger than they should have been. Finally, let me discuss a couple of policy lessons. There are many, so I won't be able to go through all of them. But I'm going to show you a few and then end up with a not such a dramatic ending. I'm going to leave with an uplifting ending. Okay, that's going to be the next slide. It's going to be a nicer slide than all this dramatism of defaults happening and bad things happening. So fiscal rules is a way out. I mean, if you really think impatience is a problem, they're borrowing too much, they're exposing their country to risk that they shouldn't be exposed to, well, then just try to fix that somehow. Fiscal rules is a way in which we have discussed this many times. Some countries have, I mean, they get a bad press because fiscal rules were behind the European Union, and they were completely ignored and kind of didn't do much. But they have worked in several countries. We have evidence that these things can be useful, and if they are designed smartly, they will do their job. And they could be able, in principle, to deal with this impatience implicit in the political decision making. The second one is to reduce your dependence on debt, to not use debt to smooth your shocks or to alleviate the bad times. Instead, save and use your assets to do that. I'm going to go back at the end in the next graph about this. And there are a little bit more nerdy ones that you could do. You can try to design contracts that are more contingent on things, like maybe you made the debt function of the income. So when income is low, you don't have to pay as much. I'll put that into financial engineering. You can maybe try to think about currency denomination. It's not the panacea. Countries do default. I mean, I don't know, there's a confusion in the press sometimes that countries do not default in their own domestic debt. They do default in their own debts, locally issued and locally denominated. But they could help, and actually that could be something that we can think about. And the other one is designing a smart maturity structure that insulates you from the type of fragility I discussed in the previous slide. All this stuff also have third-party roles. They come with moral hazard. And if you know you're going to be helped, you are more likely to do the wrong things. But they might play an important role in thinking about eliminating the fragility of the system. And things like just forgive their debts and then restructure. So I'm going to leave Mark, who is an expert on restructuring, to maybe discuss more about that. And the other thing I want to mention, in economics, usually we think of many problems as static, like a monopoly. You have a monopoly. What's the problem? It reduces production to increase prices and reap a profit, okay? Get a markup. And what we think about is, okay, a monopoly, we need to think about how we regulate a monopoly. And maybe we take our time. We do a project, we do 2 projects, 3 projects, figure out marginal costs, figure out the demand curve, the elasticity, figure out the economic, and this could go forever, and then we regulate the monopoly and force it to produce more, which is what we want, okay? In that, in these situations, things are not static, but are changing over time. Debt crisis, by construction, imply the very rapid accumulation of debt. So things that start small problem that could be easily handled, compounds. Interest rate compounds, the amount you owe increases, you keep borrowing, and there is kind of an urgency to intervene, if you must, when things are kind of small, say, in 2010 for Greece, rather than in 2012. So I want to leave you with a plot which I like a lot, and I see some of my students here, and I see some of them are working on these things, which is, have we learned anything from all these sequences of defaults? And I want to say that some countries have. What I did for this plot is I pick a bunch of countries that are poor, it's less developed countries, and I selected the ones that have changed their behavior. I just selected the ones that did something different. And actually, they are reflected in this plot. And what I have here is time in the horizontal axis. And in the vertical axis, I have in one side debt to GDP. That's a notion of how indebted you are to foreign. This is external debt. And reserve, basically, it's a foreign assets that they have. How much have they saved? And I would like to show you that for a bunch of these countries, their debt to output ratio have fallen dramatically from 80, 60% to 20% of GDP. And their assets, how much are they saving, have increased even more dramatically, from practically, almost nothing to 30 to 40% of GDP. So these countries some of them have just switched from a regime of accumulating debt and spending to a regime of reducing their debt and saving. By the way, you can see it was not maintained. So after 2010 and so on, the level of reserve on average for these countries went down. And some people say, that's a problem. No, that is exactly what they're supposed to do. Things are bad, commodity prices fell, they don't borrow, they tap into their reserve. And they get the insurance they need that way. Now, who knows what's going to happen, to the right of this plot. But it's hopeful that there is hope out there that countries are kind of learning to reduce their debt addiction and jump into more reasonable fiscal stances. So that concludes my presentation. So basically, I focused the discussion on less developed countries. I just want to point out, developed countries are different, and they're not just because they are richer. They do behave differently. We can have that discussion later in the panel, but they are not the same. Although we can maybe go back to the discussion that maybe within the European Union, some of the countries there did look more like LDCs than the rest. Right.
Thanks, Emily. So thank you, Manuel. Thank you. Are we on here? Yep. Thank you, Chari, for the fine introduction. I wish you were here to open up all of my talks. And thank you, all of you, for coming up and giving up a fine spring evening to listen to Manuel and me talk. Before I say anything else, I am obliged, just like Manuel was, to say the views I expressed today are my own. They're not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So Manuel started his talk and got more and more uplifting as it went along. I'm going to start uplifting and get more and more pessimistic as we go along. The topic was lessons from sovereign debt for state and local governments. So I'm going to organize my remarks around 5 key lessons you get when you look at sovereign debt, and then I'll talk about to what extent they're applicable for state and local governments. So first lesson, the uplifting lesson, the reassuring lesson, is that defaults are uncommon. Manuel said they were rare. I'm not sure I'd say they're rare, but they're uncommon at least. These are not the standard state of events. If you're looking at sovereign countries, and I'm going to be talking here over the last 200 years, there have been about 250 default episodes by a total of 110 different countries. The bad ones, the countries that default a lot, Ecuador, Mexico, Uruguay have defaulted 8 times, and just last year Venezuela seized the lead with its 9th default over the last 200 years. So, these are not uncommon, they're not rare. I mean, they happen with a certain amount of frequency, but they're not super common either. Now, when you look at states, the US states, there have been 23 defaults in the history of the United States, but only 2 of those since 1870. One was Arkansas around about the Great Depression, and if we include commonwealths, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico 2 years ago. So again, not super common and actually been increasingly rare recently as a result of a number of things that states did and adopted in their constitution to limit their ability to borrow. What about local governments? And by local governments, I'm going to be talking not just about cities and towns, I'll talk about counties, there's going to be school districts and other special assessment districts. Well, there have been 10,000 such defaults in the last 200 years, which seems like an awful lot. But when you count all the different special districts that are out there, there's actually about 100,000 separate issuers in existence today. So 10,000 defaults isn't really that much. There's actually about, each of these issuers has on average about 10 debt issues too. So there's about 1 million separate debts being traded out there by US local governments. but there have only been 10,000 defaults on them. So it looks like a big number, it's actually not that big. The most famous example is probably Detroit, 2013. Right? So the good news, it's not really that common, but it does happen, and as we'll see, the consequences can be bad. But that's the first lesson, they're uncommon. The second lesson I would say is that the legal resource that a creditor has in the event of a default is pretty limited. In the case of sovereign countries, the doctrine of sovereign immunity prohibited suits against countries for a very long time. You can now sue a country, but the problem you have now is it's very hard to find assets to attach and to use for repayment. Now, some of you may be a little surprised to hear that because a couple of years back there was a very famous incident in which a bunch of creditors seized an Argentine naval ship. And there's a bit of talk about how this was going to change things. But what you probably didn't know, because it was covered far less dramatically in the newspapers, is that a couple of months later, the ship was released and the creditors went home empty-handed. And that's typically been the result. There are very few things you can seize. You can try and seize a naval ship. There have been attempts to seize warplanes, all those kind of things. But typically they're unsuccessful. So there's very limited recourse for sovereigns. What about states and local governments? Well, the situation's a little bit better for state and local governments. State and local governments issue all sorts of obligations, and some of them are legally enforceable. If they issue a revenue bond, that's a bond that is secured by a stream of revenues, a toll road, a tax, or something like that, and they default, you can typically go to court and get them to hand over that stream of revenues. Likewise, if they issue a general obligation bond that's secured by the general taxes, typically property taxes of a local government, for example, you can go to court and get payment on that. The problem is they issue a lot of other things too, what we would call contingent obligations. And there your rights are very, very limited indeed. Right? So states issue things like lease-backed obligations, annual appropriation obligations. Those are kind of interesting because the bond actually says you must ask the legislature to appropriate funds to pay it, but it doesn't say the legislature has to agree. So if the legislature decides not to agree, you're out of luck. Likewise, a moral obligation bond is one that says, morally we recognize we have an obligation to pay, but there's no legal responsibility to do so. So if you own one of those, you're out of luck. And those obligations are actually pretty large. They're not half of the debt out there on average. They're not the dominant debt. But for some states and localities, the state of New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Arizona, the cities of Los Angeles, Indianapolis, and Charlotte, North Carolina, the bulk of their debts actually take this form. Their liabilities take the form of these contingent obligations for which you would not be able to take them to court. So, go home and take a look at the bonds you have in your portfolio and check exactly which ones they are. Lesson number 3, be very skeptical of governments and the data that they release. There is, in fact, if anyone here is an accountant, there is an international public sector accounting standard that governments are supposed to follow. They don't. Very, very few do. Nationally, the United States does something similar to it. Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom do too, but they actually play some funny games even within that standard. Most states are nothing like following that standard. Local governments do a bit better, at least if they want to have something traded on an exchange, they're required to do so. As a general rule, governments of all types play all sorts of funny accounting tricks. They cook their books to make the situation look better. One of the big ones are those contingent obligations I talked about before. Those contingent obligations are not legally thought of as debts. That's important. I mentioned earlier that states often have restrictions on issuing debt. Well, they have no restrictions on issuing things that aren't considered debt. They issue lots of these contingent obligations specifically to get around those restrictions, and often they don't even put them on their balance sheet. So if you look at the financial accounts, you won't even see them there. You have to go deeper than that, maybe talk to a specialist or look at a credit rating agency like Moody's to get the data on all of these things. There's all sorts of other kind of quasi-debt contracts that countries and states and local governments issue to get around these problems too, and that don't always make it onto their their balance sheet. Greece was famous for making its financial situation look better than it was by engaging in a particular derivative contract, a cross-currency swap, and not putting that on their balance sheet. Lots of state and local governments will sell assets and lease them back, which is essentially like a loan collateralized by the asset, in order to not put it as debt on their accounts. Even when they do put it as debt, they often report the debt at face value and not at its market value or its accounting value as would be implied by Ipsos. Italy was famous for doing this in Europe. In the US, a lot of school districts have done it, particularly in California. And lastly, there's a whole bunch of other liabilities that, again, are not maybe legally debts and they're not on the balance sheet, but nonetheless are probably going to be honoured in part and that can really change a country's or a state's or a local fiscal shape, the position that they're in. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And let's start with these school districts and the capital accumulation bond. So here's a table I took from a newspaper. I'm not sure if it comes through very clearly, but the details aren't really important. This is just a list of the top 10 worst debt deals by Californian school districts. And they're bad for a couple of reasons. But the main one is that essentially the school districts here are promising to pay a ridiculously large amount in the future on their loans in order to be able to sell their loans for more than what they are said to be worth on their face. So the classic example is, I think it's pronounced POA or P-O-W-A-Y. They wanted to borrow about $130 million to do something with their school. They went to the council, the city or whatever it was, the school board, and they were authorized to issue borrow only $105 million. So what they did was they constructed a debt contract that would pay investors $1 billion over the next 40 years, and then they were able to sell that debt for $126 million and borrow more than they were authorized to do. So specifically, if that's, they had this face value contract of $105 million, they pay nothing back until 2033, and from then on, they pay almost 50 million a year for the next 20 years after that. So by constructing it that way, they booked it at face value at $105 million. And they're going to look fine until 2033 when they're going to be in a whole world of hurt. So, if you're thinking of moving to San Diego, don't put your kids and don't move into Poway Unified School District. Another thing is that some of these accounting standards and different accounting measures just differ variably in terms of what's allowed when you account. I've taken here the estimate of Greece, its debt, just looking at its debt in 2014. If you went and got their official data that had debt to GDP ratios of 177% of GDP. So that's a lot. That's after they'd already cleaned up their accounts quite a bit. But an investment bank or a hedge fund by the name of Japonica actually went and looked at the data and said, actually, no, it's only really worth 70%. And therefore, attempting to write down the debt that Japonica owed was bad because they didn't have that much debt to begin with. And there are very good accounting arguments why that's a reasonable estimate. And that's the problem, is that different standards, different ways of measuring can give you very different pictures. In some work with Daniel Diaz, I kind of reviewed a whole bunch of different ways of doing it that other people have done in the past and one new one. And what we found is you could justify saying that Greece's debt was as low as 42% of GDP or as high as 180% of GDP. You can essentially make it do whatever you want it to do by choosing a more or less reasonable assumption and an accounting convention that allows you to do it. So you can get very mixed opinions, and governments know that, and they can choose how they want to do things to some degree. Now, I also talked about off-balance sheet liabilities being important. I'm going to give you some examples of that for some countries and then do it for some US states as well. Here's data on what's known as gross government debt, gross general government debt, for a bunch of different countries around the world. The United States is there. It's about 105% of GDP is the extent of general government debt. That's federal debt, but adding in all the debts of the states and the local governments too. I put Japan in because it's kind of famous for being a very heavily indebted country, approaching 250% of GDP, their debt. The UK, Germany are good comparisons to the US, often compared to it. They're actually a little bit less indebted by this measure. Italy's a bit more indebted, and Switzerland, a model of fiscal probity, the least indebted of these countries. Now what I want to that's gross general government debt. But obviously if you're looking at the ability to finance a debt, you don't just care about the gross debt, you also care about assets to some degree. So once we include assets, this is what the picture looks like. So obviously all of the numbers are a bit lower because we've subtracted off the value of the assets. But the key thing I want you to note is that we actually subtracted a lot from some countries and less from others. So Japan, which was up close to 250, actually got down to 100, a full 100% of GDP, because Japan, there's a lot of assets that the government holds that could use to pay its debts. In the case of the United States, it dropped by about 20%. Italy didn't drop very much at all. So you probably don't want to just look at gross government debt. You want to take into account some of their assets too. But I said this is all about talking about what's happening off the balance sheet. What happens when we start to include things like unfunded pensions and unfunded healthcare liabilities? So here's what happens when you add in the pensions. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference. The US jumps up, Japan doesn't, actually fell further, if you can believe it. It turns out their pension system is way overfunded. So as bad as they look, they actually are doing okay on pensions. United Kingdom, Germany, about the same, Italy about the same, Switzerland a little bit more. But now let's add healthcare. Healthcare is the big one. Even Switzerland, which before was the model of fiscal probity, is going to have a big problem funding its healthcare obligations as its population ages. The populations of all of these countries are aging. But the big one that jumped up is the United States. It's up now close to 240% of GDP. And believe me or not, that's an improvement. 5 years ago, that was at 310% of GDP. The difference was the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which reduced estimates of what future healthcare costs are going to be, and therefore made the estimate of that liability smaller. People forget that one of the main reasons for passing the Affordable Care Act was to put a lid on healthcare expenditures for the country. And according to the IMF that made these estimates, it was successful. So as you can see, Japan doesn't look so bad on this measure. It doesn't look great, but it doesn't look as bad as the US. And Switzerland doesn't look very good at all. Once you start to include these off-balance sheet liabilities, you can get a very different picture. Now, if you've been following along in the news, it's the same is true for the states. Oh, before I said that, obviously, one other big difference between the US and all those other countries is that the US is now projected to grow its debt further over the next 20 years. Here's the CBO's estimate. Federal government debt alone will grow by about 20% of GDP. Almost all of those other countries I talked to are going to be running down their federal debt, are projected to run it down in the next 20 years. What about states? Well, here what I've got is state government debt relative to total revenue of the state. Not GDP, not gross state product, but total government revenue. That means tax revenue, revenue from toll roads, revenue from fines and fees, and so on. And I've done it for a bunch of different states. The three at the left are the basket cases. Connecticut, nobody ever talks about. Illinois, everybody knows. And New Jersey. Those are the countries with some of the worst fiscal positions around the country. I'm only doing state government debt for now. And as you can see in Connecticut, it's up over 100% of their revenues, which is not that bad when you think that 1 year's revenues could pay off the entirety of the debt. Illinois, it's a little under 60%. New Jersey, about 80% or so. New York, California are states that have been in trouble before. Here's Minnesota for comparison purposes, and Wisconsin, because we all like to compare ourselves to Wisconsin. That's state government debt. And note the scale of the graph. It goes from 0 to 140. Now I'm going to include pension liabilities. And look at the scale. Now it goes up to 700%. The biggest one, Illinois, massive unfunded pension liabilities. But Connecticut's not out of the woods either. In fact, none of these states are out of the woods. But Illinois, particularly dire situation. What if we add healthcare? Well, healthcare of state government employees is actually not so bad in some of these states. In the case of Minnesota, it barely budges the numbers. But New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut grow further. So once you start to include those off-balance sheet liabilities, you end up with very large indebtedness measures for the states. And that's where the problem is going to be with state government debt in the future. How exactly are you going to fund all those pension and also healthcare liabilities? So So that was lesson 3. Don't trust the data, look deeper and try and take into account things that might not appear in a state or local government balance sheet. I don't know how much time I have. I could talk for hours about this stuff. I love it. 5 minutes? All right, so I have to speed up a little bit. Lesson 4, debt resolution takes time. These things do not end easily. In a sovereign context, it takes on average about 10 years from the first default until a final resolution that the country can then emerge from its debt problems. So a decade. The IMF worries a lot about how to make this faster. How about local governments? Well, I don't have a database of that for local governments, but I'll give you a couple of examples. People were warning about Detroit in the 80s, but in 1992, Moody's actually downgraded their debt to junk. So in 1992, this was being forecast. They didn't declare bankruptcy until 2013. And that bankruptcy agreement, the restructuring plan, wasn't accepted till the end of 2014. So more than 2 decades passed between it being recognized as junk and finally restructuring. These things take a long time to work out. What about Chicago? Well, people have been talking about Chicago's problems for a long time too. At the turn of the millennium, it was one of the most indebted states with 12.3 billion, cities with 12.3 billion in debt. They didn't get downgraded to junk until 2015, and that was even after they increased property taxes by 70%. The debt keeps getting bigger. They've tried to renegotiate, but courts have rejected the renegotiated deals. And as a result, they end 2016 with, after a change in accounting rules, about 50 billion extra debt here, and a bunch of other debt that I'm not even including, we'll come back to later. So we can expect this to drag on for a long time for Chicago, just as it did for Detroit. These things will not end quickly. Lastly, the last lesson I want to take from sovereigns, and I have less to say about states and local governments here, is that when it comes to sovereigns, the losses in the event of a restructuring and a default are not equally shared at all. Here I've got some data on external creditors, foreigners. And as you can see, and this is essentially, who do you stop paying first? And the answer is your trade creditors, the foreign banks you're borrowing from, your bilateral official creditors, which is like other countries that have lent to you. Your bondholders do pretty well in comparison. If I had data on domestic creditors, which is like domestic households, their pensions, the electricity company that supplies the government with power, they tend to get treated even worse. In terms of the eventual write-downs, Manuel said there's a huge range. Well, here's an illustration of the huge range. When it comes to banks, you can lose anywhere between 100% or even make a little money, according to estimates I came up with Christoph Trebesch and Matthias Schlegel. With bondholders, it's a little bit narrower, but the central tendency is somewhere around 50%. You lose about 50% of the value of your claim. But if you're another government that lent to a sovereign, you're going to lose more like 90% of the value of your claim. The losses imposed on creditors are very large. Now, how large will they be for state and local governments? Well, I don't have the data to tell you that, but if we look a little bit harder at Chicago's debt, I can have a pretty good sense of where it is. So this is kind of some debt that wasn't covering everything. It's a little bit hard to read. I'm sorry, it's a bit fuzzy, but this is essentially saying at the end of 2016 fiscal year, Chicago had about 70 billion in debt. And that wasn't including some accounting fudges on their pensions that when you correct for them, that adds another 15 billion. And it wasn't including some other liabilities, including that they haven't paid their electricity bills for 2 years. When you add that all together, we're up to about $92 billion in debt. And the biggest single part of that is pension debt. They owe 10 billion to the Municipal Employees Annuity and Benefit Fund, 10 billion to Chicago Public Schools, 3 billion is a share of Cook County pensions that they haven't paid, 10 billion to Policemen's Annuity and Benefit Fund, and so on. So about half of the debt is pension debt. You can wipe out all the other debt, and Chicago still has a debt problem. So we know that pensioners are going to have to take a hit in this case as well. So that's 5 lessons. I think I've used up all my time. If you're interested, here's how you can get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to take questions as Chari moderates them. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Mark and Manuel. That was really stimulating. So what we'll go through now is there are people with microphones, I believe. When you get a chance, put up your hand so that somebody can approach you with a microphone. Just give us your name, address, curriculum vitae. No,
Social security
just
number.
yeah, so we can do identity theft. But let me kick things off. That was totally cool. Let me start with something that Manuel emphasized on this, and Mark also emphasized. Thinking about state and local governments, 49 of the 50 states in the United States have provisions that require that their budgets be balanced, that the operating budgets be balanced. And what they have done in practice, this is what Mark talked about, is that they have structured the compensation of many of their employees to offer them a lot of compensation contracts that are backloaded, that give you a lot of high levels of pensions, high levels of healthcare benefits, and so on. And they do that in part, I suspect, because that allows them, depending on the accounting convention that's used, to understate the amount of their true obligations, even though they confront this. So I guess this is a question for both Manuel and Mark. Mark emphasized the difficulties in structuring accounting things. How might you structure the rules that govern state and local administrators to prevent them from understating the kinds of obligations that they're incurring, promises to pay stuff in the future, so that voters and the general public would be better informed? How would you increase that kind of transparency? Any ideas on how you might do that? More generally, an issue about how do you solve this impatience, myopia problem that Manuel talked about?
Yeah. So I mentioned that there is such a thing as the International Public Sector Accounting Standard. And the first thing I would like to see happen is to have governments everywhere adopt it. At the moment, state governments are nowhere near close to following it. Local governments do a somewhat better job, but not a perfect one. So if they all adopted that, that would help. But I think we probably need some further guidance than just the standard, which would restrict the way in which governments actually use the standard. So one of the common tricks that governments have been doing in terms of pension liabilities is that, they'll say, well, we have so much set aside and we think we're going to earn a return of 15% a year on that. And assuming we do, no problem. And of course, that's unrealistic. And until recently, there was nothing to stop them from doing that. So one thing that we're moving towards is rules that say, no, you actually have to project a much more reasonable rate of return. Now, that still doesn't necessarily work perfectly because what they've been doing is taking on increasingly risky assets and not adjusting for the risks that they're taking on in some of their insurance, some of their accounting procedures. But that's a step in the right direction in terms of at least having the data to be able to monitor the governments we have.
So one example that comes to mind on this is Chile, who has a fiscal rule that is, I think, quite successful. And it's a combination of somewhat simplicity sharing, so a simple mechanism, and also outside monitoring. So they need to forecast, for example, things like what would be the copper price in the future. Is the copper price today higher than the long-term value of that copper? You can see how that can also be played with. They need to do the same thing with, say, potential output. Is my GDP today low because of temporary reasons, or is it low because I'm going to be for a long time low? And the way they have tried to balance this out is to have very independent monitoring. Actually, two different sets of people who evaluate the situation and come up with estimates, in which afterwards the Ministry of Finance decides how to do it. It's a simple rule. It allows them some flexibility. You don't want a rule that is too tight, especially for countries. And you want them to be able to spend more when things are bad. You want them to be able to save when things are good. So you want some notion of a flexible rule that gives them some room. A very rigid rule will be violated. It will not be believable. I mean, that's kind of probably also a very complex one. Like in Europe, it was insanely complex, the budget rule. So again, you have all these tricks. So simplicity and outside monitoring, I think, were key things. They also target, actually their proposal was to target debt reduction. So they were running primary, I mean, the target was a structurally positive surplus for the government. So in net, no accumulation of debt until the debt was paid down. So they did, and it's part of the, how do they follow this? Why didn't they break this rule? And I think it's part of the understanding that this was a valuable thing to do to break out of these debt problems they face. Maybe that's kind of their history was like, they were into trouble and it was painful and this was a way out.
Let me just...
Go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing, which is, you mentioned that many state governments have rules that they're supposed to have a balanced budget. But some of those rules are only that you have to table a balanced budget, or that the legislature has to pass a balanced budget. They're not requirements that you actually have a balanced budget. And of course, when you're writing a budget, well, you have to forecast how much revenue you're going to earn and so on. And so sometimes they're a little generous in that. So it's not enough to just have that rule, but it has to be a rule that's somehow verifiable, where you actually, the data you construct is audited to be reasonable for all of those kind of rules to have bite. And I think that would be true even for some of the other rules. I mean, the Chile rule is a great example because they do have very specific requirements, even about how you forecast.
Right.
Yeah.
So you also want something like part of the flexibility. Escape clauses is one of the discussions. That if the things really go bad and they are verifiable, that the situation is dire, then you should not force the country to run a surplus. And that type of thing, combination of monitoring, simplicity, the ability to use the budget to smooth the shocks, seems to have worked for some countries.
Sure, but one of the concerns people have, and this showed up particularly during the European debt crisis, when there was a lot of pressure on various governments to try and reduce spending,
Right.
was that was exactly the wrong time to reduce spending.
Completely.
And that the austerity, so to speak, was in fact making problems worse than they might be otherwise.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, how do you spend more? Who do you borrow the money from?
Right.
So how would you think about that tension?
So
that when you run into a crisis, the needs to spend money may in fact be large, the resources you have available are limited, and so...
The crisis is too late. When you are stuck, and at that point you borrow a lot, say take Greece, we was running a primary deficit of, I don't even remember, 15% of GDP when the things go wrong. Basically, taking away debt payments, not even think about debt. They were spending more than their income by 15% of GDP. So at that point, the markets refused to lend them more money. So the question of austerity is muted. They have no choice. They really have, I mean, they either enter a deal with Europe and the IMF and try to balance that need for a while, or they really have to do a massive cut of 15% of expenditure. So my point here is the discussions cannot be in bad times. In bad times, it's just a mess. I think the time is before things happen. And again, go back to the example of Chile. Before the prices went down, before the copper price tanked, before the recession affected everybody, they already had implemented this stuff. They were already saving. They were in structural surpluses for a while. So when the crisis hit, they could take it. And they had the fiscal space, the room to do it. At the moment where the recession is happening, the debt crisis, the foreign lenders are not willing to lend you money. There's really not, I mean, this idea that they could do anything else but just cut spending and adjust revenue, it was impossible. It was really as you said, there was no, they didn't have a choice. It was a bit late.
This unpleasant message that we should keep eating our spinach now, just so that we don't fall sick 20 years from now.
Yeah, that is exactly right.
Maybe we won't do anything about climate change.
That's what I tell my children.
Maybe the whole world will blow up and we don't have to worry about all of these things. See any questions? I've got lots of questions, so we can continue. I think there's a question over there. I don't want to take up.
Yeah, there's several.
I've got tons. So we can.
How much is this debt tied to the credit default swaps during the big recession? You know, you had Italy, Ireland, I think Spain,
Yeah.
Greece was a mess.
Yeah.
Did that have some big impact on these
Oh yeah.
debt levels?
We usually think the spreads. We usually think of the CDS, the credit default swap spreads. We think of them as investors hedging or kind of protecting against each other, against the possibility of a default by a firm or a state, or in this case, countries. And they moved actually a lot, and they were very tied to the yields that investors were willing to pay for the debt of these countries. So the CDS increased for many of these. Interesting as well, the CDS of their banks, something that Mark didn't mention, but he had done work on this, is a big difference between, say, US states and Europe is that the European governments could mess up their banks, and they do. They impose capital controls, they force them to buy their bond cheaply, and it was not a surprise that measures of risk of default actually affected not only the governments themselves, but things like their banks. They move together, and this is actually one of the things, I think, one of the realizations that in international finance this was known. The Russia crisis have a banking component. If you go back to the 80s, a bunch of the Latin American crises had associated to them banking crisis. But this was another example that kind of that combination of a banking crisis with a sovereign debt crisis, they are linked. And I think that's going to be, I don't know, Mark, if you want to add to that, but you...
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, the countries themselves were not trading in CDSs, these credit default swaps, so they weren't contributing to the country's problems. But it's possible that the existence of these credit default swaps made interest rates lower because investors could insure themselves, and that might have encouraged some of these countries to borrow. There's one other point, which is, I don't have hard data to prove this, but there were several rumors that some of the banks in these countries were issuing credit default swaps on themselves. So if they got into trouble, they would have to pay other people out of when they had no money to pay at all, in the expectation that the government would bail them out in those circumstances. In that sense, they might have been taking on risk that was later passed on to the government, but I don't have hard data to support that.
So a couple of questions over there and a question over here.
Did Charlie really want our names? My name is Paul Anton. I used to work at the Federal Reserve Bank. I have a bit of ancient history, but I can get a question out of it. My business partner, when working on her PhD, was investigating the budget process of one of the states. It's west of us. And she was talking to an employee who said, well, I have a big day today because I'm doing my chargeback day. And when she asked for the details of what the person was doing, it was essentially moving revenue from last year forward to this year, and spending from this year back to last year without restating last year so that the budget could be balanced. I guess my question is, after such things as 2008, do the rating agencies in the U.S. do a distinctly better job today as a result of 2008 and other things? And are there more enforceable standards for state data and for local data that have developed in recent years?
So, no. For states, no, there's nothing enforceable. There is pressure on them to do better, but for the most part, the states have not had any problem placing their debt. So unless you have big increases in the rates they have to pay, they're not going to change. So Illinois talks about it, but it doesn't really do much. In terms of in terms of the ratings agencies, I mean, I think they're aware of a lot of this stuff, but they're very wary about how they exactly reveal this information. And let me put it this way. They're concerned that if they say, oh my goodness, this state or this city is doing something bad, they're in trouble, they will get blamed for causing a crisis. They're also afraid that if they don't say, they'll get blamed for missing a crisis. And so it's often a big political thing within these agencies as to exactly when they say what they say. So I think they feel that they're torn. I think they're trying to do a good job, but it's a difficult thing to do because no matter what happens, they're going to get blamed.
There's a question here. One back there.
Hello, I'm James Brennan. I'm just a lowly undergrad at the University of Minnesota.
We were all lowly
we were
undergrads
all
once.
lowly.
Yeah,
And my question was with the differences between the lower developed countries and the higher developed countries, why the higher developed countries are able to have these high amounts of debt without having the same issues or behavior problems that the low countries do.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are many reasons, and I think I mean one of them is the currency of denomination of the debt is quite different. Although that's changing quite a bit. So it used to be the case that emerging markets, less developed countries, could only borrow mostly in foreign currency. So that means that they couldn't really use the printing press in case of a shock or an event. Like they didn't have that ability, while more developed countries usually borrow under local law in domestic currency. So I think that's one of the key differences. In general, I would say also we don't have a great answer to this question, but the poor countries are poor for a reason. They institutions are not as good and as solid as in more developed countries. I mean, just go and try to drive in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and then come to Minneapolis and drive around, and you will see that the laws are exactly the same. It's the same traffic laws, but the institutions, the way people behave, is just very different. So it could just be that it's just a reflection that they are poor. And there is a name for this in the literature, which is usually referred to as debt intolerance. The poor countries are not able to sustain large level of debts, before just defaulting. But I think it's a good question. It's a complex one. I think currency institutions, the cost of default seems to be much bigger for developed nations than for poor ones. But even though, Europe is the case that tells you things can happen in countries that were borrowing, before 2008 at practically no spreads with Germany, which is probably one of the safest assets. And they were very close to default, and one of them defaulted.
Let me expand on what Manuel is saying. 242 years ago, Adam Smith, who essentially founded our profession, made a sustained theoretical and empirical argument that the secret to the difference in the wealth of nations lay primarily in the nature of the institutions that they constructed, and that wealthier nations had much better institutions. 242 years of research has served to make that conclusion more and more definitive by the day. So there's a reason why some countries are rich, and people in some countries are rich, and people in some countries are poor. And all of those reasons are tied to the behavior of governments, civil society, and so on and so forth. So you should expect systematically different behavior across nations, those that have developed successful institutions. But Manuel, I'm not so sure that Europe or the United States is that different from these less developed countries, right? We're all converging to a common
Hopefully
place.
higher level.
No, but actually, no, I want to ask about the European crisis, debt crisis in particular, right? Because you guys promised that you'd talk about it.
Right.
Sort of a brief description of what you think led to the crisis. So for those of you who don't know, the crisis starts roughly in about 2010 or so, with threatened default by Greece, and then threatened default by Portugal, fears of default by Italy, complex negotiations between the German government, the French government, the European Union, the IMF, about exactly how to handle these kinds of problems. Fears of default spreads to rise astronomically, and then the then president of the ECB makes a famous speech, Mario Monti, whatever it takes, spreads fall, the fever breaks, and things seem to have improved. That's sort of an encapsulated description of what happened. Why did it occur? The reason I ask that is because if we can understand what were the forces that led that to happen, maybe we can eat our spinach now and ensure that state and local governments don't end up in a similar kind of situation. Any thoughts? I'm sure you have lots of thoughts.
Mark, you want to
I mean, people forget that in 1970, Greece, Portugal, Spain were considered less developed countries, very poor institutions, and they were borrowing at very high penalties relative to the rest of the European countries. By the formation of the euro, they were able to borrow almost at the same rate as Germany, which seems crazy when you think about it. The institutions had gotten better. I mean, Spain was no longer a dictatorship, but they were not perfect. And I think the reason, my theory, lots of people would disagree, Manuel may as well, my theory is that investors thought, even though the EU constitution said that the EU itself wouldn't bail out these countries in the event of a problem, they expected Germany and France and the other wealthy countries to do so. And that's why I think the rates shrank. And that's why I think these countries ended up borrowing so much and getting into trouble. I mean, people realized this when they founded the EU. They had the Maastricht Treaty designed to kind of keep countries in line. They had these prohibitions on bailouts for a reason, but the Maastricht Treaty, the limits were not credible because they were violated almost immediately, even by the richer countries. And there was nothing prohibiting the rich countries from bailing out the poor ones. So I think that was the problem. I think Monti's speech was essentially, the ECB is there to bail out if necessary, and often when you promise a bailout, you don't actually have to go through with it as people's expectations adjust. I think it will happen again unless they make more fundamental changes to the fiscal structure of the EU.
So,
This is particularly related to the stuff that you were talking about fragility.
Of course.
What's the extent to which fragility played a role in this? Is there some way of solving the fragility problem and then we're done?
So I think I don't disagree with Mark in his initial assessment that the only way you can justify, in principle, the spreads that country like Greece or Spain had to be some sort of implicit guarantee or bailout by the rest of the Union. That seems like a reasonable interpretation of what happened. Before 2008, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the countries that were affected and how they were affected. Greece basically was fiscally responsible for a long time. And you can think of that case as just the crisis was actually, it was a result of the bad decisions they made fiscally. They borrow a lot, they continuously borrow for a while. Now, it's a little bit different from a poor country at this stage because they're borrowing at low rates. So somehow you can almost understand it. They're facing these really high low rates compared to German yields. So they borrow a lot. Ireland, another typical example, was completely different. They have cleaned up the fiscal situation. They were they were doing great. Their debt was really low. That also ran into trouble, but for a different reason. I think this case, it was not an addiction to debt. It was because actually maybe related something to the off-balance sheet things that that countries have.
I thought it was an addiction to debt on the part of the banking system.
The banking system.
Not an addiction to debt on the part of governments.
The government. So that
but
tells
governments and banks are all in bed together. Right? These guys are all part of
Well,
the same set of thieves.
So I'm a bit more optimistic on this. I think they realize, some of these countries realize they made a mistake in regulating these banks. They pay a large cost for this. I mean, islands suffer a massive recession, and I think they learned their lesson. I mean, I'm more hopeful than you are, Shari, about this. And I think the Europeans also learned that these local regulated banks are a bad idea in general, and they need to really pay attention to what's going on. I think it'd be hard to see how this can surprise them again, like a banking crisis at this level. They are better regulated. They learned the lesson. Actually, the regulation moved away from the local to the center. There's lots of stuff that they haven't done, like they don't have a deposit insurance that is, European-wide. There's more room for improvement, but I think actually for these cases, I would say it looks better, and they probably did learn. I mean, these countries are recovering, and except for Greece, it's more difficult, but they are actually managed to survive. But let me just talk about your point about fragility. I think actually Mario Draghi was the
I'm not Monty. I meant to say Draghi.
So when
misspoke.
I think it's gonna. So we always worry about when a crisis is in academia, right? We always worry about when a crisis is solvency crisis. It's just that you cannot pay and you're in bad shape. Or when it is something that we usually call liquidity. It's not the best name, but I would say confidence crisis. That is happening because people lost confidence in you. And I have to say that this usually is kind of mixed. It's hard to separate these two things, but that particular speech of Draghi was surprising for two things. One is that he managed to reduce the spreads very quickly from really high levels. And the second, they never spent a cent. So it was just an announcement that had the capacity to change things. I mean, it impresses the power of a central bank in such a situation. It's just this simple announcement was sufficient to calm the situation. Now we can have a long discussion, and probably many people, we're going to keep discussing this. How much of an implicit bailout? That is the key question. How much of an implicit transfer to these countries is Draghi making when he says, we're going to help you out? And I think, one reason they never spent anything, but maybe they would have if the situation would have gotten worse. And that quantifying that thing is not an easy question. I think work that says it's all the way, 20% of the spreads were self-fulfilling, all the way to a majority of the spread. Non-Greece was self-fulfilling. Self-fulfilling means a confidence created.
I prefer to call them expectation traps.
Expectation traps, that's good.
That's one term. That.
Did you write a paper with that as the title, Cherry? I think you might have.
I did like the title. So,
Jerry.
yes.
Hi, my name is Travis Grundy. I have a little bit of a question. Throughout the conversation, we've kind of been talking about, or more alluding to behavior of the various actors. Are we talking about this hunger for capital being more about like the time value of money, kind of trying to take advantage of it right now? Because I don't fully agree that 65 cents appreciates to $1 in a year. Or is this more like a conversation about moral hazard?
I'm sorry, I think I wasn't clear. So the 65 versus $1 is a construct to think about the impatience you need to have to engage in these things. So it's almost in your head. Think about it, it's like suppose you're the government of this country and you're doing something, you're borrowing. But borrowing is a risky thing because literally you are going to expose your nation to a default, which is costly. So you should take that into account. You are the government of this nation. You should really think through, this is going to be painful. But you do it anyway. You borrow that $1 and you invest it in what? I don't know, maybe you put it in your own bank account, right? And the question is, how big have to be suppose that how big have to be that impatience, the fact that you don't care about the future, the fact that you don't care about the fact that you will have to pay it, and that you're in principle putting your country in danger. And that exercise tells you you have to be pretty impatient. You need to be willing to choose 65 cents rather than $1. So it's a economic construct to kind of tell you, measure, quantify that parameter, that idea of impatience. Now, underlying that thing, this is what I was trying to tell you, we don't know. There are political decisions, parties come and fall, the Argentinian Congress burns down. I mean, a lot of stuff happen. But when we tell you, let's put a number to it, that is the number we get.
Right. Let me ask one last question, which Mark alluded to it. I think Manuel may also have. Why is it so difficult for the parties involved in these things? I'm thinking in particular about, for example, the pension and healthcare obligations, to make those obligations contingent on the future state of the state government or the local government, what revenues they have. It's true that formulation transfers some of the risk to the debt holders, in this case, employees and others who feel entitled to certain healthcare benefits. But the current system, as you guys have emphasized, already exposes them to significant risk because there's a decent chance you're not going to be able to pay some or any of it. So you might think that it might be easier for people to planning their futures if they had some idea about specific contingencies in which, guess what, you're not going to get to see the doctor you would like to see when you're 85 years old. You're not going to get to be in as nice a nursing home if our tax revenues run short. Why is it so difficult for us to structure debt contracts or employment contracts which have those contingencies built into them?
So, I mean, I can answer that from two perspectives. One is, given we are in the situation we are, why can't we move to that now? And I think the problem there is often the courts. For example, in the case of Illinois or in Chicago, the teachers agreed to restructure their pension obligations, and it was the court that struck it down. So there the issue is we're locked into something that's not very good, and we haven't been able to get away from it. Now, why is it that they didn't design it that way in the first place, other than perhaps not having thought about it? But why don't we set up a new system now? I mean, I do think that the employees who are going to get these pensions really value the insurance that a guaranteed payout is going to provide. And I think there are other issues about writing these kind of things that depend on the amount of revenue. Is there an incentive for the government to lower taxes so the revenue is not so high that you can't pay? Are there other kind of strange incentives? Can the government play with its books to make it look like revenues are worse? So I do think there are these issues that we need to solve to get around it. But there are examples of it. We saw a talk today about Alaska's basic income scheme, which the payout is indexed to the performance of the portfolio. So it can be done. There are precedents, but it's partly, I think, the novelty and partly the demand for insurance that politicians are happy to give into because they know it's going to be some other politician who has to pay later on.
Okay, so I want to summarize what Mark said in one way, and the sovereign wealth fund is a good example. So I want to contrast two countries, both starting with the letter N, both of whom discovered sometime in the last 50 years significant resources of oil, a valuable commodity. Both of them set up sovereign wealth funds where they were going to take some of the revenues from selling the oil to outsiders and hold on to that sovereign wealth fund and then distribute it to future generations over the next several hundred years. One of these countries, the sovereign wealth fund has a ton of money. It's one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. The other, that's Norway. And the other, which is Nigeria, found a successful way to do what I think is the economically rational thing, which is to spend the money now. You know, the hell with the future is sort of my attitude to this. So one way of describing the challenge these guys have laid out is how do we set systems up so that we end up looking more like Norway and less like Nigeria? That's the challenge that I think confronts us all. So thank you very much for what has been an extraordinarily stimulating discussion. We have a reception immediately outside. Please join us for that. Thank you.
Well, there's some thank yous. First, I want to thank Mark and Manuel. You did a fantastic job. I want to thank Litigation Analytics. They co-sponsored this event, and in particular, I want to thank John Scarborough, who's one of our former PhD alum, for helping out with that. I want to recognize that there are many here in the audience who are the board members of the HHEI and help us guide this wonderful ship. Ray Carter, Chari, Armin Choksi, Ed Foster, Carla Haugen, Zenas Hutchison, Jose Paris, Norm Rickman, Art Rolnick, Lowell Schwab, and Gary Stern. Thank you guys, as always. Lastly, I want to, as we enter into the reception area, I want to point out that one thing that HHEI does is we fund undergraduate research opportunities. So some of our undergraduates have set up posters showing off their research. So please have a look at what they're doing, because I think it's very interesting what they're doing. And please ask questions too. They're there to get feedback on their work. So let me thank the speakers again tonight, Mark and Manuel and Chari. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Good job, guys.